Hi, and welcome to 1.2 Thinking Like a Historian. In today's lesson, we're going to think like historians. So, our objective. In this lesson, you will learn to think like a historian, including analyzing conflicting claims, consider multiple perspectives, and finally, evaluate the reliability of sources. So, first off, what is history? History is an account of the past. Accounts differ depending on one's perspective, and we rely on evidence to construct accounts of the past. So, we must question the reliability of each piece of evidence. Then finally, any single piece of evidence is insufficient to build a plausible account. So, what that really means is that we need to build on multiple pieces of evidence to make sure that account or that claim is solidified or it's correct. So, types of sources. We have primary sources, which are original sources of information recorded at the time an event occurred. So, examples of these are diaries, poetry, personal interviews, government documents, autobiographies, artifacts, and photographs. They can also be written after in the form of memoirs or oral histories. Then you have secondary sources. Sources of information derived from primary sources. Example of these are summaries, analysis and interpretation, encyclopedias, articles reviewing sources, textbooks, biographies, and dictionaries. So, knowing all of this, we're going to dive into the lesson and get started with our assignment. So, like I said, let's start thinking about a historian. Imagine that you are a principal of a school and you just found out that there was a fight in the lunchroom during lunch. You've asked many students and teachers who witnessed the fight what they saw so you can figure out who started it. Unfortunately, you received many different accounts that disagree about who started the fight, who was involved, and finally, when it started. It's important to remember that no one is lying. So think about no one is lying throughout all this process. So, questions to consider. How can there be different stories of the event if no one is lying? Think about that. Who are the different people who might have seen this fight? Just don't think about it as just teachers and students. Finally, what might make one person's story more believable than another person's story? So, why is one story more valuable than the other? Or why is one story more reliable than the other? So, take your time and see if you can answer these questions. And notice you need to please pause the video to answer these questions in your assignment for today's lesson. So take a pause real quick, take about 2 minutes, 3 minutes, answer those questions, and then come back to the video. All right, good. I'm glad you're done. So, make connections to social studies. The principal needs to consider which stories are more or less reliable because it's important to understand why the fight began. Not only is it important that the instigator, if there was one, be punished, but also it's important to think about how to prevent such fights in the future. Also, historians, in trying to figure out what happened in the past, essentially engage in the same work. So, just like the principal, there is no way to actually recreate the moment or time travel to witness it. So, the only thing historians have to work with is the remaining evidence. So, ranging from people's stories to physical artifacts. So, it could be just from the teacher, one of the teachers in the lunchroom who saw the fight happen, to actually having video evidence of seeing the fight happen. So, it ranges from people's stories or to physical artifacts. And lastly, you're going to need to know how to source. And sourcing is the act of questioning a piece of evidence and trying to determine if it's trustworthy. When you source, you ask how people's biases, or perspectives shape their stories. So, this doesn't necessarily mean that a person is lying if he or she comes from a particular perspective or a certain bias. They might still have something valuable to contribute to your understanding of what happened in the past. But as a reader, it's important to keep in mind that each person sees the world in a particular way. When you keep that in mind, you are sourcing. So, to debrief, why might people see or remember things differently? Who has an interest in one person getting into trouble instead of another? Who was standing where? Could they see the whole event? Could they actually see all of the event? Are they just hearing other stories? The plausibility of the stories themselves, aka issues of exaggeration and how the story fits into what is known about the student's prior history. Is the story believable? Is it trustworthy? How will you know? And lastly, time. Do stories change over time? How might we remember right after the event differ from what we remembered a week later? Does time make the way someone remembers something more or less trustworthy? So think about those questions. And remember, they're all open-ended. So you should probably write down at least a sentence or two to answer each one of these questions. So that being said, make sure you have completed the following assignments from this week. 1.1 Textbook Scavenger Hunt, 1.2 Thinking Like a Historian, and finally 1.4 Middle Ages, or the Middle Ages quiz. Next week, we will dive into content and start using readings from our textbook. Remember to watch any videos I've posted in the lessons, and please call, email, or G-chat me if you have any questions. Good luck with today's lesson.